Hello. I don't know how well you could see me. Sorry, let me I can get better. Where's the sun coming from? That's better. Okay. Okay, hello again. I just wanted to make a very, very quick video on the Andrew Jackson and the Indian Removal Act. Since the video or since the article was so long, I wanted to give you guys an alternative to save you some time. And really, I could summarize it very quickly. So, before I dive right in, I just want to say there are a few scenarios that I had to leave out, but I wanted to mention them to you guys, and I really strongly encourage you to look them up if you have time on your own time. One of them is during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, he suspends the right of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus meaning to know why you've been detained, if you've been arrested, and to petition for your release. So Abraham Lincoln suspends that right, and the Supreme Court actually comes after him and tells him, you're obviously violating the Constitution. And it gets to the point where Abraham Lincoln actually threatens to arrest the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court if he continues to resist him. But Abraham Lincoln does eventually go and get approval from Congress. So that just kind of goes towards the legitimacy of a president and of the court. And so I don't want to go too much into it. It's a really interesting story. I chose not to do that one in favor of the two that I have chosen. The other one is more of a symbolic stance, but it deals with governors, right? And this is kind of an issue of federalism. And it's the after Brown versus Board of Education, Governor Wallace decides that he is going to ignore the court ruling. So if you get a question in the AP exam about, what action can a state take? Well, in some instances, a state can ignore a ruling of the Supreme Court. And in essence, this is what's happening in the Andrew Jackson case, because really it's the state of Georgia that's being challenged. And you're going to see a difference in the case of Governor Wallace. Obviously, the schools were integrated. The government called, I believe it was Eisenhower, called on the National Guard to forcibly integrate the schools. Governor Wallace's resistance was mostly symbolic, and he understood that when he was making his stand. But Andrew Jackson and the Indian Removal Act was a little bit different. So let's go ahead and begin. Really the conflict begins because within the states of Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, there are, within what is considered the territory of those states, native tribes who have boundaries within those states' boundaries, right? So it's a little bit of a complicated situation. And the real question, legally, the real question is, are those native tribes considered sovereign nations? If you recall, Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, it describes rights that are denied to the states, the denied powers to the states. And one of those is to negotiate treaties with foreign nations. And this is exactly if the native tribes living in those territories, if they are considered foreign nations, then Georgia was violating the Constitution and it was violating the law. But if they weren't considered foreign nations, then what they were doing wasn't a problem. Georgia in particular was negotiating with the Cherokee to try to get them to leave, because the land that the natives had were very attractive. It was land that poor white settlers could have, they could have settled there. They could have gone there to build wealth for themselves, and it would have overall increased the wealth of white people in the state of Georgia. So Georgia was taking the initiative and negotiating these treaties, and that kind of pushed the agenda for the federal government. Now, in his State of the Union address, and the State of the Union address, by the way, is huge. When we talk about the president's ability to set the agenda for Congress, the State of the Union address is really important for that, because basically in a State of Union address, and this is, by the way, how Thomas Jefferson and Adams both set the agenda for what they wanted to do with the court system. They both addressed it in the State of the Union address. So usually, when the president talks about something in the State of the Union address, Congress knows that it's something that that they're probably gonna wind up working on, because the president is also the party leader. So, a little digression there. So Andrew Jackson goes in and addresses it, and he says, "This is something that we're going to do. We are going to forcibly, or we're going to evict all the natives from our land." Now, what the Indian Removal Act actually did was it simply authorized the United States to exchange the land that the Native Americans currently held for land in Oklahoma. So essentially, it gave those states negotiating chips when they're trying to negotiate the exit of the native tribes from their land. So, but in a lot of cases we use the word negotiate loosely here, because really they were going to leave whether they liked it or not. And at the time, the culture at the time was essentially, there was a question of, can we coexist with the natives? And the answer resoundingly in the United States was no. They were believed, and excuse the language, but they were believed to be savages. That was the language of the time. And they were just thought to be uncivilized. They were uncivilizable, isn't a word, but I think you get the idea, right? Like they couldn't coexist with the natives. So, so the only other solution was to get them to leave. So there were some allies, right, in the Supreme Court, or rather in Congress. In particular, Henry Clay didn't like didn't like Andrew Jackson and wanted him to fail. So he hired the previous Attorney General of the United States to challenge the act. So Georgia had passed a law basically to get rid of the natives, and they were using the Indian Removal Act passed by the National Congress to support their law. They challenged the Georgia law under this pretense, under Article 1, Section 10, that, hey, these guys are a foreign nation, you guys are negotiating with them. That's obviously illegal. So they lose the case in the Supreme Court. But there's a later case, Worcester, I think I'm saying it right, versus Georgia, where essentially, there's a missionary who's trying to proselytize, trying to convert the natives to Christianity, and the guy violates a law that says you can't, no white person can go live with the natives. That is like a segregation law. So that makes it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decides that Georgia cannot make that law because they're making laws about the territory, about laws of a sovereign nation. And so he basically reverses the decision in the previous court. And by reversing the decision in the previous court, it basically makes null and void all laws that Georgia are trying to pass against the Cherokee tribe. So Marshall was trying to be clever here, right? Because we know that he is. We've seen him be clever before. And he was, because what's the difference between the Cherokee Nation v. Georgia and Worcester versus Georgia? It's the respondent, right? And I'm not going to answer the question for you, but that has a lot to do with it. When you think about public sentiment, Marshall is thinking about the legitimacy of the court, like he usually is. And what are the optics of my decision going to be? So when you have Worcester, who's a white Christian who's trying to do the work of God, and he makes a ruling in favor of him, Marshall's probably thinking, this is going to be a decision that people support. It's going to be difficult for them to go against it. Jackson proves him wrong, right? And where Jefferson fails, Jackson doesn't. And Jackson basically, he says, Marshall has made his decision. I'll let him enforce it. Which, when we think about what Hamilton said in Federalist 78, we know that the Supreme Court, it's sarcasm, right? The Supreme Court has no enforcement powers. So he forcibly, so then he mobilizes the United States military to support Georgia's laws and forcibly removes the natives from the land, starting the Trail of Tears and the Seminole Wars. And that starts the new age of history between the United States and the native tribes. So that's pretty much the summary. There are some things to consider here. So this part's going to get edited. Okay, so what else did I want to say? Okay, so the things to consider here are, why was Andrew Jackson able to get away with this? Just blatantly ignoring the Supreme Court. How is... Okay. All right, so there's a few things to consider here. First, why is Jackson able to get away with this? When we saw historically... Oh, hang on. Okay, so Jackson able to get away with it. Can't pause this thing. So there's a few things to consider here. First, why is Jackson able to do this when Thomas Jefferson just kind of had to deal with it? Why does Marshall make a different decision in this case as opposed to the Marbury case? So I'm going to leave you guys there. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. And the questions are all in the worksheet. Of course, there is the last one. I didn't make a video for the FDR assignment because it's very, very short, the readings. So that's it. If you guys have any questions, you know where to find me.